to the emotional biases, and like we talked about before, these ones are a little bit more difficult to people because they have feelings tied up in their thought processes about these things. And one of the biggest ones that we see is loss aversion. And that's when people prioritize preserving principal or just avoiding losing money over earning gains, and it hurts them in the long run. So there's been studies that have shown that actually the pain of a financial loss sticks in people's heads much more strongly than the reward, I guess, of experiencing a gain.
An example of this too would be someone that's so afraid of losing money, quote unquote, on paper, that they just say bury all their money in a can, in a coffee can in the backyard, so they know they're not going to lose their money. Well, but they're not earning anything on their money, and they're losing buying power with that money, even in a normal interest rate environment. In today's interest rate environment, the biggest financial threat, we've talked about on these Bobcasts before, the biggest financial threat to all Americans and everybody in the country, or I mean in the world, is this super high inflation that we've started to experience, and is just going to get worse because the government printed so much money. And so, you know, if you have your money, let's say somewhere quote unquote safe, like the bank, so you can't lose principal, you still are losing buying power with it. Because if inflation is 10 or 15% and you're making 5%, you're going in the hole every year that happens and losing buying power. So the loss aversion bias causes people a lot of problems, especially when people have been kind of fearful over the last 3 or 4 years. We notice a lot of people have been hoarding money.
And so, I mean, there is times in certain specific situations, of course, where people need to protect their principal. Like if you're saving up for a specific purchase and you've had some money that you're saving up for a down payment on a home, or for things like that that are near-term things where you can't afford to lose anything. Of course, there's situations where you need to invest to protect your principal, but with this loss aversion bias, it's people, because they're fearful, invest too conservatively to meet their goals. Whether that's, a lot of times that's retirement or retirement income. It also causes people to sell when they should be buying and sell when they should be buying and buy when they should be selling. So they might have like an asset that is going in the hole and it's just fundamentally not a good asset anymore, but they don't want to sell it and take a loss on it, just because they don't want to lock in that loss, and so they'll hold on to it when it's no good anymore and they should have got out of it before,
right? So
the next emotional bias that we have is overconfidence bias. And this kind of goes with that control bias that's a cognitive bias, but it also has it's emotional because it has ego involved in it. And it's thinking that you can control investment outcomes if you know enough. If you're smart enough, you can
beat the market,
or you can, not have your account go down when everything else go down, things like that. And it's kind of also, you are responsible for gains, but something or someone else, AKA like the economy or the stock market, is responsible when you experience a loss. So you take credit for gains, but you
blame
a victim when it comes to when it comes to losses, and it's all tied up into ego, and that's why it's an emotional bias.
So another one is staying stuck biases. So that's being so comfortable, being too comfortable to make changes, or being too scared to make a mistake. You're just kind of frozen with fear, or just don't want to make the changes that you should make.
And this is something that can cause people to, I think people can get comfortable maybe in portfolios that are maybe a little bit too conservative for what their goals are, just because they're like, well, I'm not losing, so It's okay when really they're not experiencing the same amount of gains that they really need to be probably experiencing for the goals that they have.
Which again is so important now, because the biggest financial threat to everybody watching this webinar, and frankly, everybody in the world, is this super high inflation that we're facing that's going to keep going on for a while. So we need to invest our money in asset categories or classes that protect against inflation.
Okay, and then the final biases, I've wrapped these up into one. They're a little bit different, but it's endowment bias and affinity bias.
Affinity bias. You said it right this time.
Yeah, I kept saying infinity
In the
earlier.
practice, yeah, but it's affinity.
And basically, endowment bias means that because you already own something or you bought something, you consider it more valuable than it really is. So basically, you're giving it undue loyalty just because you already own it. And Dad has a really good story example of that.
Oh, yeah. I just realized we've got the French fry slide up there, and that's to remind me of the French fries. So long time ago, 20 years ago, I had an office in Omaha that I worked at part-time from Bob Benny Wealth Management in Omaha. And I had this guy come in that had retired a few years prior with $500,000 in his 401k. He rolled it over into his own self-directed IRA and then started buying stocks with it. The account that was $500,000 at retirement 3 years later, when he came to see me, was only $80,000. He ran it from 500,000 to 80,000 in 3 years. And I looked at he showed me the statement. I looked at the stocks, and I remember I kind of did it like this, went kind of like a humph. These are all penny stocks. And the guy's response, I'll never forget, was, well, they weren't penny stocks when I bought them. A penny stock, by the way, for those of you that don't know, is a stock whose stock price is less than $5. And he said, well, they weren't penny stocks when I bought them. Well, one of these stocks was called Tasty Fries. I mean, I go, what the heck is Tasty Fries? And he said, well, it's a company that produces and sells vending machines that sell French fries. That doesn't even sound like a good idea to me now, but obviously it wasn't a good idea because they weren't able to sell very many of those vending machines, and the price of the stock went really down, and that was a significant part of his loss in going from 500,000 to 80,000 in the whole account. But he was just stuck on that Tasty Fries. He just thought, oh, this is a good idea. And then as it went down, he thought, well, maybe it'll come back up. And then as it went down, he was just stuck, and he couldn't get out of it, or wouldn't get out of it.
That's a great example of this endowment bias that we're using it for, but it also, there's other biases. It's an example of other biases that we've talked about too. So it's an example of that loss aversion bias where it's going down, but man, I don't want to take a lot of those stocks. Man, I don't want to take a loss on these things.
I lost.
It's an example of the overconfidence bias because he thought, well, I can do this, I can do this myself. I know how to pick these. These are all going to be just ringers, type of thing.
They were ringers, all right.
When they weren't. So it's a good example. And then affinity bias means basically you're giving more value to a particular investment or company if it's a stock, just because it's something that you like or it's like familiar to you, when maybe intrinsically it's really not that valuable and you're holding onto it.
Like maybe this guy really liked French fries and liked the idea of just putting a quarter or whatever you do and getting some fries.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't have been as good as McDonald's fries.